Did you know that there is actually a quilter's code? Here's a quilter's coded message for you to decipher. The current BOM, sponsored by my LQS, uses FEs and FQs to make a quilt top filled with QSTs, HSTs, and HG blocks. We will be paying close attention to our SAs as we sew our pieces RST. For some added fun, we may do a little FPP and even some EPP along the way. This is not a pattern that will allow for QAYG, but FMQ and SID will work well. Let's get this WIP done start to finish so it doesn't end up as a UFO. Keep watching and let's crack the code. Hi, I'm Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting. We're going to crack that code as I reveal what all of those letters stand for. So let's get started. BOM, Block of the Month. A block of the month, BOM, quilt, is a subscription-based quilting experience. The quilt pattern is divided up into portions, and each portion is usually released monthly, often as a kit, with the required fabrics. The benefit of a block of the month allows quilters to pace themselves as they create each monthly block on their own time. Sometimes it's presented as a mystery and you don't know what each month will be, while other times you actually see the finished quilt and you know exactly what the finished quilt will look like at the end. It's a fun and really interesting way to complete a quilt. EPP, English paper piecing. English paper piecing, or EPP, is a method of quilting that involves stabilizing fabric pieces with paper before sewing them into intricate designs. It usually involves hexagons of all shapes and sizes, but it can also involve honeycomb shapes or basically anything that you want that would be fun to sew by hand and use this technique. Grandmother's Flower Garden is an example of an EPP, or English paper piecing project. EPP is done by hand, which makes it a really good on-the-go project. FE, fat eighth. An eighth of a yard of fabric is 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. A fat eighth, however, is actually created by cutting a 1/4 yard, 9 inches by the width of fabric, and then cutting it in half. A fat eighth allows more versatility when cutting pieces from it. It's wider than the typical 1/8 yard cut of fabric, which is kind of long and thin, 4.5 by 42 inches. Instead, we have 9 inches by 21 inches. FMQ, free motion quilting. Free motion quilting is the ability to sew stitches into a quilt sandwich, anchoring the 3 layers together, the front of the quilt, the batting, and the backing, using either your domestic or home sewing machine or a long arm quilting machine. Domestic or home sewing machines can only move in straight lines, and those lines are controlled by the sewing machine's feed dogs. When you disengage the feed dogs, then you can stitch in any direction and move the fabric in order to create the free motion stitches. On a long arm machine, the quilt sandwich remains in place, and then the quilter moves the long arm machine to create the free motion quilting stitches. FMQ, free motion quilting. FPP, foundation paper piecing. Foundation paper piecing, FPP, is a piecing technique in quilt making. The technique uses paper that's marked with the quilt block lines as a foundation to stabilize the quilt block as it's constructed. Once the block is completed, the paper is removed. More difficult or more challenging blocks can be easily constructed using this technique. There can be pineapple blocks, there can be blocks that are images, all sorts of options when it comes to foundation paper piecing. FQ, fat quarter. This is similar to the fat eighth, however, we are using a 1/4 yard of fabric. A 1/4 yard of fabric is 9 inches by the width of fabric. A fat quarter uses a 1/2 yard cut of fabric, 18 inches by the width of fabric. So we cut that 1/2 yard and then we cut it in half again. A fat quarter is a 1/2 yard cut of fabric that is cut in half, giving us an 18 inch by 22 inch approximately piece of fabric. Similar to the fat eighth, a fat quarter allows more versatility when cutting pieces. FQ, fat quarter. HGS or QST, hourglass square or quarter square triangle. The hourglass square and the quarter square triangle are basically the same block. The difference are the fabric choices. The square is made up of 4 triangles, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they form a square. The hourglass square is usually made with 2 fabrics to give the hourglass look to the square. The quarter square triangle can be made with 2, 3, or even 4 different fabrics. HGS, hourglass square, QST, quarter square triangle. HST, half square triangle. A half square triangle is a square quilt block unit made from 2 right angle triangles. Half square triangle. LQS, local quilt shop. A local quilt shop is a standalone store. It's not a chain store like Joann's or Hobby Lobby, and it's usually privately owned and run by a local resident. LQS, local quilt shop. OOP, out of print. When fabric is no longer being manufactured, it's considered out of print. OOP, out of print. QAL, quilt along. A quilt along is made up of a group of quilters who are making the same quilt pattern on a predetermined schedule. They're making it from their homes rather than sitting in a class in person. The Project Linus Mystery Quilt Challenge is a perfect example of a quilt along. QAYG, quilt as you go. Quilt as you go is a process of actually quilting each block of a quilt, the block, the batting, and the backing individually before assembling the blocks into the quilt top. We start out sewing the first piece to our batting and our backing, and then we just continue sandwiching that block as we go along. These quilt as you go blocks are then sewn together to create a quilt. RST, right sides together. Most fabrics, other than batiks and solids, have a right and a wrong side to them. When sewing pieces together, when we're quilting, we always place our pieces right sides together before sewing them. The right side is usually brighter, some call it the pretty side. The wrong side is usually more faded, it has a faded look to it. RST, right sides together. SA, seam allowance. A seam allowance in quilting is the 1/4 inch distance from the raw edge of the 2 fabrics that have been sewn together and the seam or stitching line. If we place our ruler, we can see that's 1/4 or 1/4 of an inch, our seam allowance. SID, stitch in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch is a quilting technique which involves sewing down the channel of an existing seam. As you can see, the seams are usually pressed in one direction or the other, and there is a low side and a high side. When you're stitching in the ditch, you stitch on the low side all the way around whatever it is you want to quilt. By sewing down the seam line and matching the thread that you're using to your fabric, the stitches basically are relatively hidden. SID, stitch in the ditch. SQST, split quarter square triangle. The split quarter square triangle quilt square is a variation of the quarter square triangle. Remember, the quarter square triangle had 4 triangles, 1 on each side. The split quarter square triangle is actually 2 of those quarter square triangles and a half square triangle. That's why it's called the split quarter. 1/2 of the block is 1 fabric and the other half of the block is 2 different fabrics. SQST, split quarter square triangle. UFO, unfinished object, a quilt project that is not currently being worked on and isn't finished. Not to be confused with WIP, work in progress. UFO, unfinished object. WIP, work in progress. An unfinished project that is currently being worked on, my log cabin quilt, is called a work in progress. WIP, work in progress. WOF, width of fabric. Fabric is on the bolt just like this. It is folded in half, and the manufacturer's edge or the salvage edge matches on one end, and then there is a fold on this end. So if you open up the entire piece, it usually measures between 42 and 44 inches in width. From salvage edge to center to salvage edge is the width of fabric. Some fabrics are wider, especially those that are used as backing fabrics. They can be up to about 108 inches wide. WOF, width of fabric. So now that we have cracked the code, let's go back to our original message and see what it actually said. The current block of the month, sponsored by my local quilt shop, uses fat eighths and fat quarters to make a quilt top filled with quarter square triangles, half square triangles, and hourglass squares. We will be paying close attention to our seam allowances as we sew our pieces right sides together. For some added fun, we may do a little foundation paper piecing and even some English paper piecing along the way. This is not a pattern that will allow for quilt as you go, but free motion quilting and stitch in the ditch will work. Let's get this work in progress done, start to finish, so it doesn't end up as an unfinished object. IAATTBJ, I am always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thank you so much for joining me.